Hello, everyone. Welcome to a really special episode. We're continuing with our series on Jewish history, but in particular, we're talking about the history of the Jews in England. Now, in our first episode, we were thrilled to be joined by historian Trudy Gold, who joins us again now to delve into part two. In the first episode, we spoke about the first settlement until the time in which the Jews were expelled. And now we're going into the period of 1656 to 1881. And this is now going into the second settlement. We decided to stop at 1881 and carry on in part three because there's just so much to cover. And one of the things that I think is surprising for those who aren't super familiar with the story of the Jews in England, I think many assume that most Jews that will be in England will be Ashkenazi, but actually, in the second settlement, we have majority Sephardim, the Sephardi Jewish community, coming to settle there first initially. So, Trudy, there's a huge amount to talk about, and so much that has ripple effects in English culture and history, and beyond that, that happens in this era. So, I'm really excited to learn from you.
Thank you very much, Ollie. And as ever, it's lovely to be back with you. Now, the first thing I want to say is that I think the first settlement established that it was very much on a line with what was happening on the continent. Jews were there because they were useful to the crown. When the crown was weak, Jews were in trouble. There was huge hostility from the church. And finally, the Jews had outlived their financial usefulness and were expelled in the reign of Edward I. So from 1290 to 1656, ostensibly, there were no Jews living in England. How come then? The second settlement is going to be very, very different from the first. How come then that Max Nordau, who opened the first Zionist Congress, he actually proclaimed there's only one country in the world free from the taint of anti-Semitism, and that country is England. With the first settlement, we saw it was the first for the blood libel. It was a first for the wearing of the Jew badge. It was the first for an expulsion. How come by the time the Jews come back to this country in 1656, what had changed? So 3 centuries later, when Max Nordau proclaims England is free of Jews, and also when we come to the next session, when I look at 1881 onwards, England was so closely bound up with Zionism. Never forget that the Balfour Declaration was issued in this country. So England, even though the Jewish community has never been very large, is a very important community in terms of the history of the Jewish people. But before I start with the second settlement, I want to talk about England in the absent years, when ostensibly there are no Jews in England between 1290 and 1656. Well, we know, obviously, a few would have stayed behind. They may have converted. In fact, the Domus Conversorum that had been set up in England in the reign of Henry III, there were even a few Jews living in it in Elizabethan times. And obviously, some would have melded into the English population. But what is fascinating is the image of the Jew in literature when there are no Jews here. If we take two of the most important figures in English literature, I remember when I studied A level, we had to do a Chaucer and Shakespeare story. Chaucer was writing the Canterbury Tales around 1390. This is 100 years after the Jews are expelled, and yet one of the stories is the story of the blood libel. When you come on to Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare, who was a populist playwright writing in the reign of Elizabeth II, when he wrote The Merchant, it was based on an Italian tale. And of course, the merchant is seen to the audience as the evil one. We know that Burbage, who would have played Shylock, when he came on the stage wearing the traditional red beard of the Jew, the audience would have booed. The genius of Shakespeare, of course, is to make it much more complicated than that. And of course, in Shakespeare, you have that wonderful, wonderful line, which to me is really, it's a signal of the Enlightenment to come, when Shylock says this: I am a Jew eyes. I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? Now, this just gives you a notion of the genius of William Shakespeare. But the point is, the audience would have seen the image of the Jew, the pantomime villain, and actually a contemporary of Shakespeare's, Christopher Marlowe. He wrote a play called The Jew of Malta, in which the Jew Barabbas really is the evil one. He's the devil. It is almost a comedy. And ironically, it's based on the life of an extraordinary character who was working at the court of the Sultan of Turkey, a man who was international, because I think it's important to remember that at a time when the Jews are going through a terribly bad patch in the Christian world, Islam, provided Islam felt secure and provided Islam was ruling, Jews could live in peace under Islam. They could never rule Islam, but live in peace under Islam. And that obviously will be the subject of a second presentation. So Jews are in the culture, even though there's no Jews there. And I think it's important to remember, those of you who are interested in the history of Jew hatred, there is not, despite what I've said about Shakespeare, there is not a positive image of the Jew anywhere in European literature until the European Enlightenment, when a German playwright called Lessing writes a play called The Jews in the 1740s, and it actually fails on the Berlin stage because no one could imagine a Jew as a hero. So you've got this negative stereotype. And we also know that there would have been some Jews in Elizabethan England. Let me take you a little into Jewish history. Jews had lived in Spain since Roman times, the Iberian Peninsula. And when Islam conquered in 711, they created an extraordinary Islamic empire. In fact, the Islamic empire in Spain, actually, they were stopped from taking France at the Battle of Poitiers. That's how far, those of you who know your geography, that's how far the armies of Islam had advanced. And under Islamic rule, under relatively benign Islamic rule, Jews lived in a period of relative security. Gradually, Christianity encroached, and it culminated in 1492. Ferdinand and Isabella, Ferdinand of Aragon, Isabella of Castile, had joined together. They'd linked their countries and created a Christian Spain. They expelled the last Muslim stronghold in 1492. And in 1492, at the Alhambra Palace, they issued the Edict of Expulsion on the Jews of Spain. And it's going to extend to Portugal because in 1497, the Queen of Portugal, the daughter of the King and Queen of Portugal, Ferdinand and Isabella, married the King of Portugal. Written into the marriage contract was the expulsion of the Jews. Now, why on earth did this happen? As Christianity encroached in Spain, in 1391, there was a horrific outbreak of Jew hatred, and thousands of Jews had converted. They were known as the New Christians, and they were very successful in Spanish society. There was a lot of resentment from other Christians on the New Christians, and Isabella was a fanatical Christian. She had as a confessor a man called Thomas de Torquemada. He was a Dominican, the Hounds of God, and they were zealously trying to purge the Christianity of heresy. Don't forget, there's already been so-called heresy with the Cathars and the Hussites, and later on, the greatest heresy that Catholicism is going to face is, of course, Protestantism. But that's a few decades later on. Now, one of the beliefs was, whilst there are still Jews living in Spain, there will be Judaizing. So consequently, the edict of expulsion. So Jews are expelled from Spain. Ironically, thousands of them went to Rome, where the Pope Alexander Borgia invited them in for money. A few thousand went to Turkey. The Sultan actually sent his ships to take them in. Others made their way through Europe to the east, but that's not the point. The point is that many thousands of Jews living in Spain are converted, but many of them practice their Judaism in secret. Now,
Did
1492 is
Trudy,
one of the most.
did those that were expelled include the ones that had previously converted? That they thought that somehow
No,
the
no,
Spanish.
no. Only those as Jews. The conversos are in Spain. They were
And they're
also
considered fully Christian.
they were also called Moranos, and Morano is the word from Spain for swine. But the conversos were always at risk because we know that many practiced their Judaism in secret, and they
Right.
tended to marry amongst themselves.
Hmm.
And they also upset their Christian rivals. So they were subjected to the Inquisition. Torquemada had introduced the Inquisition into Spain to wipe out heresy. It could never apply to Jews proper. They're not heretics, they're just Jews. But it could apply to conversos. Now, 1492 is one of the most important dates in European history. You tell me, what else happened in 1492?
Columbus sailed the ocean blue.
Yes, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And this is the beginning, of course, of the creation of the great trading empires. Many of these conversos became traders. Now, conversos or Jews had a huge advantage because there was Jewish communities from country to country to country, and they could communicate with each other. So we know that some of these conversos came to London. Quite often they were known as Portuguese merchants. They would have gone to the Catholic Church, they would have prayed there, but many of them were in fact secret Jews. Donna Grazia, who was one of the richest women in the world with a huge trading empire, we know that she actually was a converso. Her husband died, left her his fortune, and she actually made her way to Venice and then finished up in Turkey, where she came out the stents in the Ottoman Empire. She came out again as a Jew. And we know that she visited London. And we also know that Queen Elizabeth had a Jewish doctor, Lopez. He was actually executed as a spy because he fell foul of one of Elizabeth's favorites. We also know that um, there was a merchant called Hector Nunez, who was also a physician. He was a spy for Lord Burleigh. If you look at Elizabethan England, if you think about it, Protestant Elizabethan England wants to rival Spain in trade. And Spain is the enemy. The Catholic Spain is now the enemy. And Lord Burleigh actually supported this man, Nunez, who was a spy for him. He was a converso, but he was also a very important merchant. So we know that there are trading links now because England is emerging as a very important financial center. And the other thing that happens, you've got to see the 16th century as a century of huge change. It's the beginnings of the growth of mercantilism, merchanting, and it's also the beginnings of the real development of Protestantism. Now, what's all this got to do with Jewish history? Well, one of the problems of studying Jewish history, and I know many of your viewers have quite a good grounding in this, is you have to know enough to understand where the Jews fit into it all. Where does this tiny people fit into the great events that are swirling around them? Now, when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, proclaiming abuses in the Catholic Church, he ignited a fire. And gradually, many countries converted to his doctrines. Now, why? Quite often, look, if you think about it, I mentioned that it was Borgia who allowed the Jews into Rome. Borgia was Pope. What do you know about Alexander Borgia. Well, he had a very interesting son called Cesare, the Pope with his family, who had a incredible career as a great fighter. Lucrezia, the daughter of the Pope. Yeah, Pope would, when Shakespeare says in Hamlet to Ophelia, the words of Hamlet, get thee to a nunnery, he meant go to a whorehouse. There was huge corruption in the Catholic Church. Think of some of the Medici popes. They were figures of the Renaissance. They were great art collectors. What has this got to do with the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth? Blessed are the poor, for they will inherit the earth. And monks and nuns and priests began to read the Bible. There was also an interest in Hebrew scholarship. This is all sort of augmented by the age of discovery, the knocking into new cultures, the beginning of the lifting of the veil, really the beginnings of the early stages. It's too early to talk about an enlightenment, but an expansion of knowledge. The invention of the printing press made a huge difference. Many countries converted to Protestantism, not the rulers didn't necessarily convert out of a belief system. Quite often they converted because they wanted to break away from the power of the church. There was a family called the Habsburgs. When Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain died, their elder son died and his son died, and the throne eventually passed to a man called Charles, the grandson. He was also a Habsburg. He becomes the Holy Roman Emperor. He protects the papacy. He controls much of Central Europe through the Habsburg dominions and Spain. They said of him, Stupa Mundi, the sun never set on his empire, because he owned all the conquests of Spain and Portugal. That was his domain. Of not Portugal, Spain, beg your pardon. That was his domain. So the Catholic Church, and what about all these Protestant rulers? And then Holland, which is part of the Habsburg Empire, breaks away from Spain and becomes Protestant. And Holland becomes an important seafaring country. And the Dutch adopt a very pragmatic attitude to any merchant who wants to settle there. And gradually, Antwerp and then Amsterdam is going to become an important center of Protestant thought, millenarial thought, and also a haven for Jews. If you visit Amsterdam, the great Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, which is wonderful. Now, they're not given equal rights. We're not in that kind of world yet. But the point is, those of you who love art, think Rembrandt. He lived in the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam. He painted the Jewish bride. He painted Jewish faces. They're not put in ghettos. And many of these characters are important merchants. They are useful. They are useful to society. I'm not talking about a large number of people. I'm talking about a small number of converso merchants who settle in Amsterdam. And another thing, in 1648, there was an appalling catastrophe in the Jewish world. The Khmelnytsky massacres. The Ukrainian Cossacks. Ukraine was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at this stage. The Ukrainian Cossacks wanted to break away from the weak Polish crown, and they went on the rampage. It took 8 years. They killed Catholic priests. They, in fact, were Orthodox Christians. They killed any Polish noble they could get their hands on, and Poles and Jews. Nearly 100,000 Jews were murdered in the most appalling carnage. And it led to a belief in the Jewish world, because what is going to happen at a time of huge sorrow? The coming of the Messiah. Now, the notion of Messiah in Jewish eyes, Mashiach, is very different to that of the Christian Messiah. The Mashiach means an anointed one who will come to save the Jews. But there was a lot of belief in this in Amsterdam, and also in the Christian world, millenarial thought. In England, let's go back to England. You have the dynasty of the of the Tudors. And then who takes over from the Tudors? Elizabeth dies childless. Elizabeth, the great merchant queen, who made England a glorious place. Think of the great privateers, all her people like Francis Drake, Walter Raleigh, expanding the English mind. But she dies childless, and the throne passes to the Stuarts. James I, then Charles I. Now, Charles I married Henrietta Maria, who was a Catholic. You also begin to see the rise of a sound English middle class. They want freedoms. Charles clashes with Parliament. And in the end, there is a revolution in England led by Oliver Cromwell, who was a Puritan. Now, the Puritans were fascinated by the Hebrew Bible. They believed in a very low church. They wanted to get rid of all the iconography. And they were interested in the Jews. And they were also interested in the second coming of the Messiah. Now, the Christian Messiah is divine. What had happened in 1648 was even written about in England. And Samuel Pepys says that the Jews are in his diaries, talks about the Jews awaiting their Messiah. So millenarial thought was terribly important in Puritan England, but also so was pragmatic trading. Oliver Cromwell was a total pragmatist. But many of his parliamentarians weren't. There had been conferences of the levellers in Parliament where they even talk about bringing the Jews to England to convert them, because there is this belief that the Messiah will come, the Jewish Messiah, and the Messiah will come again when Jews are spread throughout the world. Just as today, amongst some religious Christians, there is the belief, one of the reasons they support Israel is that the Messiah, their Messiah, will come when the Jews are returned to their own land. So it's very important to remember this kind of thought in a world that is really enveloped by religiosity. And then we come to a fascinating character called Manasseh ben Israel. Manasseh ben Israel, he was the son of a converso. The family, he was actually born in Madeira. The family came to Holland, where the father baptized, his children had been baptized. He consecrates them as Jews and names them Ephraim and Manasseh. Well, where does that come from, Ollie? Ephraim and
Joseph's son.
Manasseh.
Yeah. Joseph's sons.
I think they are two of the sons of Joseph. And he is given a religious education. He lives in Amsterdam, which is a great center of Protestant thought as well. There's mixing between Jewish scholars and Protestant scholars. He meets a man who, by the way, who tells him about the 10 lost tribes. One of the lost tribes is meant to be in South America. There's a lot of interest in these ideas. And he petitions Oliver Cromwell to allow the Jews to come back to England. And the petition is fascinating because it says any nation that looks after the Jews will profit from it. And he talks about the countries that have been good to the Jews, like the Turks, like the Ottoman Empire, like the Dutch, and how those countries profit. And also, as a result of all of that, it's put before Parliament. And now we come to a mystery. The day when the readmission was discussed has been torn out of the record books. Yeah, there was no edict of readmission. But what we do know is that there are already a few Portuguese merchants, converso merchants, living in London, and they petition for a synagogue, which is granted. They petition for burial grounds, which is granted. So you have a few merchants now who are already living there, and others come over from Holland, and they're very useful to the state. We know that when Charles II comes back, when the monarchy is restored in England, Charles tended to overturn anything that Cromwell had done. So it's very good that the records were torn out. We'll never know the answer. Were there other things discussed on that day that nobody wanted to be discussed? We don't know. But the point is, Charles II, he's then petitioned by merchants in the City of London. Don't forget that in Parliament, the Speaker sits on the woolsack. It's become a very pragmatic country, England. What's the woolsack about? English wealth. It's a merchanting country. They're engaged in many wars, Britain. It needs merchants, particularly international merchants, who can help with the supplying of armies. And by 1670, 40% of the diamond trade with the East India Company is in the hands of Jewish merchants living in London. Now, there are Jewish merchants in Madras. This is where it becomes very, very useful. And they become so important that there are no, if you look at the records of shipping on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, those days are not open for trading. So you've got a small group of wealthy merchants who are useful to England. And the original synagogue is burnt down. They then build the wonderful Bevis Mark synagogue. And that is built very much on the same models as the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam. The minutes were in Portuguese right up until the early 1800s. And Samuel Pepys writes about the synagogue service. And also, we know that gradually their Judaism became far more lax because they built, the wealthy merchants built estates where along the river, Richmond, Isleworth, there were no synagogues there at that time. So they come into England and, for example, in 1672, Charles II is on the throne. He is ostensibly a Protestant. He probably had Catholic sympathies. He's ruling a country that has been beset by religious controversy since the reign of Henry VIII. Do you remember we talked about that last time? How Henry VIII became a Protestant, not because he believed. Back in 1521, he'd actually written a pamphlet, Fide Defensor, Defender of the Faith, for the Pope. He divorced his wife. He needed an heir. And he couldn't divorce Catherine because he needed the blessing of the Pope. And who was in control of the Pope? Charles V, Catherine's nephew. Okay, it might be a good idea to put up these charts, of the kings and queens of England. It's very useful for people because it's like creating a jigsaw puzzle. Really, from then on, if you think about it, his son comes to the throne, he's Protestant. Then his elder daughter, Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, takes England back to Catholicism. A lot of Catholics are burnt. And then Elizabeth, who is Protestant. And then the throne passes to her nephew, James I of Scotland, brought up as a Protestant. Charles I, was he a secret Catholic? Certainly, his wife Henrietta Maria was a Catholic. Then you have the interregnum under Cromwell. Charles II comes back, he's a Catholic. When he marries the Catholic Catherine of Braganza, the dowry was negotiated by a Portuguese converso who came with her to England called Duarte de Silva. So there were 35 heads of family, Jewish heads of family in England in 1700. I'm looking at a very small number of merchants. And also, they'd been conversos, so they were used to mixing in Gentile society. And we know from some of the diaries that Jews dined with English aristocrats. They're not a threat to England. They slip into England. They admire the English aristocracy. They build themselves stately homes. We're beginning to see also poorer Jews coming in from the Ashkenazi world. Just as Sepharad is the Hebrew for Spain, Ashkenaz is the Hebrew for Germany. It means the Jews of basically Middle and Eastern Europe. And the Great Synagogue is built for them in 1690. So they slip in. We know then, of course, in 1688, a very important event in British history, the Glorious Revolution. James II, the son of James I, is a Catholic. The throne is taken by his Protestant sister Mary and her Dutch husband William of Orange. They come over, the Glorious Revolution. Who comes with them? A few Jews. They are useful, they perform services. And William knights his Jewish banker, Solomon de Medina. Solomon de Medina also supplies the army. So again, powerful Jews, useful to the crown. By the 18th century, London is England. London is the world's most important financial market. When the stock market is created, there were 124 members of the stock exchange. The number of Jews was limited to 12, but that's serious. So that's why they're there. Look, there was a certain amount of hostility. The bishops would get upset from time to time. But the real bête noire of British society from then on is Catholicism. Don't forget there'd been a Catholic plot, the Gunpowder Plot, to blow up Parliament. Now, if you believe that every society needs a scapegoat, tragically for England, it was the Catholics. They were the scapegoat. They were the persecuted ones. And the Jews are sort of slipping in. Now, what is very interesting is that in 1672, Charles II had actually instituted a declaration of indulgence. He did extend civil liberties, certain civil liberties, to Protestant non-Church of England characters, also to Catholics, because he was a man of peace and pragmatism. So already the English are thinking in a different way. This is not Spain. This is not Portugal. It's pragmatic England that is gradually going to become master of the world. And in 1760, the Board of Deputies is created. This is a body of Jews that is made up. What happened was in 1760, when George III ascended the throne, the Jews sent a petition of welcome, the Sephardi Jews, and the Ashkenazim said, "Why are you neglecting us?" So they created the Board of Deputies, modelled on the British Parliament. Later on, the United Synagogue is going to be modelled on the Church of England, where the ministers will wear canonicals, if you think about it. There is a chief rabbi to emulate the Archbishop of Canterbury. This is the beginning of the love affair that the Jews have with Britain, with England and Britain. I always talk about England because at this stage there isn't much settlement in Scotland or in Wales. That's going to come later on. That's going to come after the huge influx of Jews. And please remember, it's only a small number. And
how many are we talking at this point?
Hmm?
How many at this point?
Well, there were 8,000 in 1753. This is a tiny number of people. But for example, in 1760, what had happened was Maria Theresa, who was a very strong Habsburg Catholic monarch, began to expel Jews from Bohemia and Moravia. Aaron Franks, who was an important Jewish merchant, actually petitioned George to ask him to petition Maria Theresa. It was unsuccessful, but he did. And in 1788, by the way, Daniel Mendoza became the British boxing champion. There are now poor Jews coming to England, and they're settling here, but there's not many of them. So that's the point. And then you come to the lives of three most extraordinary individuals, which also gives you a notion as to why England is different. And the first one I want to talk about is an extraordinary character called Moses Montefiore. Now, Moses Montefiore was born in 1783 and he died in 1884. He lived to be 101. He came from his family originally had come from Italy. His uncle bought him a seat on the London Stock Exchange when he was 21. He came into a very privileged merchant family. He married an Ashkenazi girl, a girl from another wealthy family, Baron Cohen. They were Ashkenazi, but also merchants. He married a woman called Judith, who became Judith Montefiore. She had a sister, Anne, who also made a very good marriage. She married a man called Nathan Rothschild. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about Montefiore and Rothschild. Montefiore, he becomes a stockbroker. He also was a hugely important businessman, very popular in the city of London. He was involved in insurance companies. He really was a great businessman. But when he was 40 years old, he retires from business to devote himself to philanthropy, both in England and also to help Jews in trouble. And he is the man to whom Jews throughout the world are going to turn when they have problems. And not only that, he was a friend of Queen Victoria. I'm jumping on a bit. He had an estate in Ramsgate. And when Queen Victoria was a little girl, because just to bring you into English history, think the Hanoverians, George I, George II, George III, and then George IV, William. William dies childless. Just to recap a little bit on British history so that you understand what's going on. William of Orange, the Glorious Revolution, he and his Protestant wife Mary had no children, thrown past to Queen Anne. Queen Anne, and of course in her age, in her time, it was the great Duke of Marlborough. None of her children survived, so the throne then passes to a distant relative, George I of Hanover, and then you have the Hanoverian dynasty, which rules right up until the reign of William. So you've got George I, second, third, fourth, William. He dies childless. The throne then passes to Queen Victoria. So Montefiore's life spans the last of the Hanoverians and the Victorians. So he's this wealthy man, very popular in the city. Now, England is also becoming a more liberal pace. In 1828, Catholic disabilities were removed. There was also the idea behind the setting up of University College London. If you wished to graduate from Oxford and Cambridge, you had to swear on the King James's Bible. Now that stopped dissenters, Catholics, or Jews from graduating. UCL, which was known as the Godless Place in Gower Street, was actually set up for dissenters. Also, this liberalism was encompassed in all sorts of ideas like prison reform, alleviating the lot of the poor, poor law reform. England is becoming the master of the world. So there's a great deal of self-confidence in England. And you have, as a result, Jews are not really seen as a threat at all, whereas on the continent, they tended to be there at times of huge seismic change. Remember, there were no Jews in England officially between 1290 and 1656, at a time when England undergoes its parliamentary revolution and its religious revolution. So the Sephardim had slipped into England, the Ashkenazim, very small in number at this stage, and certainly not enough to make any real ripples. Yes, there were sometimes anti-Jewish outbursts, but in the main, there's no ghettos. It's completely different from mainland Europe. And when you have a character like Moses Montefiore, when Queen Victoria was a child, and a very unhappy child, her mother's estate bordered that of Sir Moses Montefiore, and they became friends. He was also in very much a figure of the British establishment, but he was a religious Jew. He visited the Holy Land, as he called it, 7 times. He and his wife kept kosher, and when he dined at the palace or with the Duke of Wellington, he was served kosher food. So you have this ostensibly very serious Jew who was a Lord Lieutenant in the Home Guard. When he travelled abroad to help Jews in trouble, he stayed with British consuls. And his brother-in-law, Nathan Rothschild, was another extraordinary phenomenon. He was the cleverest son of the incredible Rothschild family. The family had begun in the ghetto of Frankfurt. where the father became the coin dealer to the Duke of Hesse, the Hesse regiment, the Hessian regiments, you know, the mercenaries. He was one of the richest men in the world. Meyer Amschel Rothschild in the ghetto of Frankfurt. He starts out as the coin dealer to the Duke of Hesse. In the Napoleonic Wars, he saves much of the Duke's fortune by transferring it. He had 5 brilliant sons. Nathan was sent first to Manchester. It gives you a notion of the power of England. Manchester was the centre of the cotton industry, where India, the jewel in the crown of empire. And he comes to London and he marries the daughter of Levy Barrett Cohen, which makes him brother-in-law now of Moses Montefiore. And he is a brilliantly astute banker. His younger brother is in Paris, and he had an incredible intelligence service, and he becomes one of the richest men in the world. He's a stockbroker, and there's no riots in England about this. Don't forget that a lot of English fortune is built on trade. So the point is, you have important characters in England, and Moses Montefiore and his friend Sir David Solomon, they are figures of the British establishment. In fact, the City of London changes its oath to allow both David Solomon and Moses Montefiore to become councilmen and aldermen. So it's slow and it's gradual. There's no edict of emancipation in England. And then you come to probably the most extraordinary phenomenon of the whole of the 19th century, Benjamin Disraeli. Benjamin Disraeli's grandfather had come from Italy to England. He had become a successful merchant. He had a seat on the London Stock Exchange. He bought himself an estate in Edmonton. Those of you who are living in Britain, that will give you a notion of the size of England, London and geography, because it was a village at the time. But he kept his house in Stamford Hill. He had a son called Isaac. Isaac, his father was wealthy enough that he didn't really have to earn a living. He became a man of letters. He had many literary friends, and he had this son, Benjamin. Now, Isaac Disraeli had a quarrel with the elders of Bevis Mark Synagogue. They wanted him to become a warden. He didn't want to. So they fined him, and he refused to pay the fine. He himself didn't convert. In fact, he became one of the founders of the first Reform synagogue in England. And Reform Judaism in England was so British. It had nothing to do with theology. It had to do with the fact that some of the people at Bevis Marks didn't like the others, and also they lived too far away to walk. That's how the Reform, later on, doctrine becomes part of it, but not in the beginning. And he decides to convert his children. His next door neighbor, who was a literary man, he said, look, if you convert him, he's going to have a much better chance in life. So even though Benjamin Disraeli was circumcised, and even though he sees himself as a Jew, it's very interesting. He is baptized. And of course, I could spend hours talking to you about Disraeli's career. Disraeli was an absolute genius. And he is the man, he's going to become one of England's most popular novelists, and he's going to enter Parliament. If he hadn't been converted, he could never have entered Parliament. But the point about Disraeli is he saw himself as a Jew. He said, all is race, there is no other truth. And when he was in Parliament, in a debate on emancipation, he said, because what happens is the tide of liberalism meant that why on earth shouldn't the Jews be emancipated? The debate is going to rage for 30 years. And in the end, the Commons are going to go for it. David Solomon stands 7 times, but he's not allowed to take his seat, because for an act to pass in British law, you need the assent of the House of Parliament, the House of Lords, and the Royal Assent. The House of Lords wouldn't give their assent until 1858. And in the end, it was sorted out because it was decided that each house could have its own oath. So in 1858, the first Jew to take his seat was actually David Solomon's, and Lionel Rothschild, the son of Benjamin, becomes a Jewish MP. But I want to read you a description of Disraeli by the wonderful Isaiah Berlin. Those of you who love the history of ideas, can I recommend Isaiah Berlin's books to you? I'm reading from Against the Current, Essay in the History of Ideas. And this is how he describes Benjamin Disraeli. Because if you think about it, he is the grandson of a merchant, the son of a minor man of letters who lives in Bloomsbury. And yet he is going to become Prime Minister of the Tory party at the height of empire. I'm sure many of you, and as I said, Britain's most popular novelist of the time. Very few people read him now. But he also had a huge social conscience. He wrote in his book, Sybil, there are two nations, the rich and the poor. And he also said, when the cottages are restive, the stately homes should tremble. He was an extraordinary character. And this is how the great Isaiah Berlin described the great Disraeli. A somewhat fantastic figure, an ambitious opportunist, a social and political adventurer, flamboyant, overdressed, the epitome of dandyism and artificiality, rings on his gloved fingers, elaborate ringlets of hair falling about his pale, exotic features, with his fancy waistcoats, his rococo eloquence, his epigrams, his malice, his flattery, and his dazzling social and political gifts, admired but distrusted, and by some feared and loathed. A Pied Piper leading a bemused collection of dukes and earls, solid country gentlemen, and burly farmers. One of the oddest and most fantastic phenomena of the entire 19th century. Disraeli believed in empire. And it was in 1878, when he was Prime Minister, there was almost a European war. And Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, who had brilliantly unified Germany, who was a very close friend of Disraeli's, and Disraeli settled the peace of Europe. And when Disraeli left the conference, Bismarck said this, "The alter Jude, das ist the man." That is how the Chancellor of Germany referred to the Prime Minister of England. And when Disraeli came back to England, he issued a famous phrase, which was later completely corrupted. "I bring you back peace, but peace with honour." He was a close friend of Queen Victoria's. He said, on the subject of royalty, you lay it on with a trowel. She'd written a small book of verse, and he always said, "We authors, ma'am." He created her Empress of India. He bought the Suez Canal with Jewish money, with Rothschild money, because he wanted to cut the sea route to India by 4,500 miles, and the Khedive of Egypt was bankrupt. And the mob were on the street screaming for Disraeli. He was an
And Trudy,
extraordinary,
was he?
but
What
at
this?
his
This is
core, he was a Jew. Not
right,
a,
but this when you talk about the crowd, this is what interests me. Was he seen widely in English society as being Jewish
he
or
threw it
not?
down everybody's faces. He said, all
And
is
it
race, there is no other truth. In a debate on emancipation, he said, how can you not emancipate the Jews when half the world worships a Jew and the other half his mother?
so and it didn't bother. This is very interesting, though.
Well,
It doesn't bother
well,
English
it bothered
society.
some. It certainly bothered Gladstone, who called him the Hebrew mountebank and conjurer. Um,
Interesting.
but Gladstone was exasperated by Disraeli. Don't forget that Gladstone was very puritanical. Disraeli had had a very bohemian life before he married, but he was an extremist after he married, and he married a woman for her money. She was 12 years older than him. She was too old to give him children, but he probably didn't want any heirs because Disraeli was enough. He was an egomaniac. But he made her his fairy queen. And when she was dying, he said to her, "Madam, you've been more of a mistress to me than a wife." I mean, he was the schmoozer of all time, Benjamin Disraeli. Some people thought he was a complete charlatan. I actually think he seduced England, but England seduced him back. Go and visit his stately home at Beaconsfield. He fell in love with England. And that's what so many Jews did.
Mm.
And you see the emancipation process, it's long and slow. In 1871, Oxford and Cambridge removed its oath so Catholics and Jews could graduate. Jews were allowed to go to the bar in 1871. So it's no edict of emancipation. They slip into England, and England they fall in love with. You see, that's what's so interesting. Anti-Semitism is the key to Jewish survival, quote unquote. Now, what on earth do I mean by that? But the floodgates haven't opened yet. By the time Disraeli dies, there are under 60,000 Jews in Britain. And yes, you do have the poor Jews. You have Rag Fair. You have anti-Semitic and pro-Semitic characters in Dickens, but they're not that important. That's the point.
Mm.
England rules the world.
Mm.
And what happens to the disaffected middle classes? What is happening to them in France? What is happening to them in Germany? Well, there's lots of problems. In Britain, they're sent out to India and they've got half a dozen servants.
Yeah.
It's a different world, which
Mm.
is probably a good place to stop because the next one is going to be about the floodgates opening. Because then, beginning in, oh, and I should mention, the Sephardim were very wary about too many poor Ashkenazim. In fact, one of the families, I think it was the Costa family, paid in the 1740s for a group of Jews to be settled in Georgia, sent them off to America, and
Oh
bought
wow.
land in Carolina for Jewish settlement. Later on, in the 1880s, wealthy Jews are going to do that again.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because there's you have it the other way around, is when Israel's formed, when it re-established, you have the Ashkenazim and Sephardim who are saying, 1 second, there's too much Ashkenazi elitism. So it's interesting how it kind of plays the other way around here.
Jews are just like everybody else.
Exactly. Yeah.
Some say only more so. But I really would say to your listeners who've never looked at Benjamin Disraeli, he really is worth looking at. He's a fascinating character.
Mm.
He was loathed by many, but also admired by many. He created a faction in Parliament called Young England. Look him up in the Oxford Dictionary and who was in Young England? The children of the aristocracy.
Mm.
His closest friend was Bentinck, who would cross the floor with him because he said a fellow should never stand alone. They called them the Jew and the jockey, the Derby, Lord Derby.
Yeah, yeah. And so much of
Uh,
the language been used in British politics today, he shaped. We think about one nation, the one nation
One Nation
conservative.
Tories.
Right.
Disraeli created the modern Conservative Party, no question
Yeah.
of it. He did have he was the Jewish outsider who believed in social justice. He said once, I am the blank page between the New and the Old Testament. He was very, very witty. In a debate when he was in opposition, he said, His Majesty's government are like a range of Italian volcanoes, spluttering and soon to become extinct. When Queen Victoria made him go to the House of Lords because he wasn't well, he said, I'm dead, but in the Elysian fields. When he became Prime Minister, I have climbed to the top of the greasy pole. Queen Victoria adored him. He was
Wasn't there
brilliant
a
with women, but he always liked older women. That's another strange thing about Disraeli.
That is
He loved to be
interesting.
admired.
Mm.
He's a real
Wasn't there a
character.
terrific quote of him in Parliament where he's talking about his ancestors versus his opponent's ancestors?
Oh yes, no, he writes it. He writes in a book. When your ancestors were running around gathering acorns in the woods, my ancestors were on conversation terms with the Queen of Sheba. Look, think what Disraeli looked like. He had jet black hair. He dyed it as he got older. There's lots of letters between him and his sister about his hair. He looked very Semitic. He couldn't hide it.
Yeah.
It was his weapon. When he first stood for Parliament, somebody pushed a pig's head into his face. He understood it all, but he went beyond it. But
Wow.
but in the end he wanted to seduce England, but I think England seduced him. Queen Victoria became his fairy queen. He was allowed to sit in her presence. And you know, he
Mm.
was at a supper party, I think it was in Sandringham, where he rose to his feet in her presence without permission to toast to the Empress of India. He made her Empress of India. She loved it.
Yeah, yeah. Wasn't
He was a,
he Churchill's favorite prime minister?
he was too clever by half,
Yeah.
but he was a one-off. You can't categorize him. He made fun of Gladstone because Gladstone would save fallen women. When Disraeli was a young man, he had quite a few adventures. But once he married, no more adventures. But he was an extremist. He makes this older woman. He said of his wife, she's a wonderful woman, but she can never remember who comes first, the Greeks or the Romans.
Oh, that's terrific.
You gotta
It's
love
that
the
it's
guy.
it's that's it's not surprising therefore that Churchill was, idolized Disraeli because he also was a man that loved witty lines and is
Oh,
remembered for that.
Churchill was a lion in my book. Look, every great person has feet of clay. Let's get real.
Yeah.
You know, we are human. We have the human condition. But
Yeah.
characters like Churchill steps up. Look, he saved a nation. That's why I
Yeah.
got so cross when people defamed his statue. Yes, of course
Yeah.
he made mistakes, but he was a man of his time. So was Disraeli.
Yeah. Of
You have to judge people in the context of their time.
course.
And oh, by the way, Disraeli was also very close to the Rothschild family. Don't forget, it
Mm.
was Lionel Rothschild, Nathan's son, who lent him money for the Suez Canal. That's a wonderful story. What had happened was the Khedive of Egypt, who was ostensibly a client of the Sultan of Turkey, of the Ottoman Empire, I should say the Ottoman Empire rather, he was bankrupt, and Ferdinand de Lesseps, the brilliant engineer, had built the Suez Canal. And the French wanted it, the Russians wanted it, the English wanted it. Disraeli believed in the balance of power. This was a doctrine of Palmerston and Peel. He wanted it for England, as I said before, because it cut the sea route to India. Parliament wasn't sitting. He needs to raise £4 million. And we know the story because his secretary, Matthew Corrie, reports it. He goes
Mm.
to see Lionel, who is evidently peeling a grape, and he says, my master wants to borrow £4 million. And Rothschild said, what's your security? And the answer was the British Empire. You shall have it tomorrow. And as I said, the working classes were out screaming for Disraeli. When Disraeli died, his favourite flower was the primrose. A third of the citizens of London wore the primrose. The Primrose League was created in his honour.
Oh
He was a
wow.
hero to many.
Wow.
Um, a very, very controversial figure. You see, Gladstone was a dour Scot. His family money came from trade. It's another reason, that the Sephardi merchants, nobody worried about them. The majority of the British aristocracy had been killed off in the War of the Roses, so you have new aristos. And also, he was an oddity.
Mm.
Wouldn't you have liked to invite him for dinner? If I could,
Absolutely.
I mean, one of my favorite games is who out of history would I want to meet? And I think maybe at the top and very near the top is Benjamin Disraeli.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to meet Gladstone. I might admire him. I might find him a brilliant man, but I wouldn't want to meet him.
It's
It's a good
interesting
game
because
for your
Gladstone,
listeners. It's a very good game for your listeners to play, actually. Who in
yeah,
history would they like to meet?
yeah, it's a really fun game. But what's interesting to me about British politics is that Gladstone also really shaped some elements of British conservatism, especially like the more libertarian Thatcherite. Uh,
He was a
oh,
Whig. He was a
right, he
liberal,
was a Whig,
Gladstone.
but he wasn't. Right, he was a liberal. But I'm saying, but many people on the conservative right today look to Gladstone as a bit of a ideological figure for them, which is quite
You see, what
interesting.
is interesting about the era of Gladstone and Disraeli? Look, if you think about liberalism, 1832, which is before Queen Victoria hits the throne, even, you have the first Reform Act, the enfranchisement of 40-shilling freeholders. There were a lot of reforms in Gladstone's time and in Disraeli's time. Disraeli introduced a lot of poor law reforms. He understood social justice, but also, look, he was not a man of the people. He dreamt of aristocracy,
Mm.
but he believed in paternalistic, the giving, that it was the duty of those who had to help those who hadn't.
Yeah.
So we've got to keep him in his time.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he and Gladstone, but I think this has also got a lot to do with Jewish emancipation. Actually, there's something I'd like to read to you. I think this should go in too. When the Jews were emancipated, this is how it was dealt with. And I think it's quite, because of course there was press on it. This is what Punch, remember the magazine Punch?
Mhm. Sure.
1868, the elections of 1868, where there are new people in Parliament. 12 jolly Quakers, or those who were such, are elected MP, not a Quaker too much. 12 jolly Quakers and 7 jolly Jews were the right sort of birds for electors to choose. For none than a Quaker's more ready to fight when he thinks, as he usually does, that he's right. And none more than the Jew is ready to pay when he sees the money will go the right way. And when our war estimates come, will come too, the pluck of the Quaker, the sense of the Jew. We look to them both, though the colonels may storm, for liberal provision, but searching reform. So hooray for the voters, with wisdom to choose our 12 jolly Quakers and 7 jolly Jews. But do you want to hear what the Jewish Chronicle said?
Yeah.
Which gives you a notion of what I think is one of the big problems in Anglo Jewry. Every movement and every vote of theirs will be identified with the community, and the latter morally held responsible for their public acts. What if it should be our misfortune to be represented by men only nominally Jews, without Jewish feeling and without Jewish conviction? Would it not be better for the Jewish community not to have any members in Parliament and to be represented by men of this kind? That's 1861. Says it all, doesn't it? You see how dangerous history and knowledge is?
Oh, it's fascinating. Well, it's also just interesting to see just the, human nature just ripples through history, and
Of course.
we're not all that different from our forebearers.
I would say we're not much different from the people who came out of the caves. We just got more sophisticated tools. You think there wasn't kindness then?
There wasn't what?
Kindness then? Of course there was.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a wonderful quote of Einstein's when somebody said, how will World War III be fought? He said, I don't know, but I do know how World War IV will be fought, with sticks and stones.
Yeah.
We have created this unbelievable technology. What we're doing with it. Don't
Yeah.
put that in. This is just me having a ramble.
Of course, of
Have you got
course.
enough there, Ollie?
No, this is great. This is absolutely great. Well, let me just wrap up by saying,
We need to do a bit of cutting and editing.
I don't think not too much, to be honest. I think this was terrific, Trudy, and I'm really looking forward to part three. Where I mean, what's going to be covered in part three when we go from
I
1881 onwards?
suggest we
Presumably,
do 4.
okay.
Let's do 1881 up until the German and Austrian Jews arrive.
Hi, thank you so much for watching. To watch another one, click here. To stay up to date with all our content, click here to subscribe. And if you're able to, you can help support JTV to grow and grow by clicking join below this video, where you can become a member and get perks including early access to videos and private live discussions with me. But most of all, you'll be partnering with us on our mission to change the world.